Welcome back to Tools and Track. Why is this squint? Everybody always suggests that this is played up for the camera, that we are Scottish, but like legitimately there's bagpipes playing in the background right now. Before we get into it, you're probably going to have a bit of a question. What the hell happened during that whole MX-5 stuff? And yes, there are now throttle bodies on here, but there's not going to be for long, and I'll explain why. And I'll explain very quickly, the IVA. I don't think I'm going to get away with these, or if I do, it's just going to be a whole level of drama. I've got the original manifold, I'm going to put this back on, so spoilers for what's coming when this car does go on the road, but for the moment, it doesn't need them. It's an added level of complexity, and no. I put them on to make sure they would fit, and they fit. That's all I need to know at this stage, so we're going to reverse that. Let's get into the proper stuff. Where is this going? So, Locost doesn't sit straight. Now I've done a couple of things here to try and...
Wrong. You've done a couple of things wrong.
Obviously. Now, in order to isolate where this fault is, I jacked the back up in the diff, so the car would tripod, to see if the fronts would then level out. They did not. So there's obviously something wrong with the fronts, because that should level if the back was causing the squint. And then I thought, let's just make sure. So I jacked the front up and tripoded it so that the back should then level out, and it doesn't either, right? Which means both of them are exactly the same level of squint to one side.
Do you know what I thought at this point?
What?
Buy a pre-made car.
Like a Primera? There's going to be a problem somewhere on the suspension pickups. Now, bear in mind the effort we've went to with the chassis. It's going to be straight, we know it's straight. It won't have bent at any point because it's never been used. I'm putting my hand on that. That's the case, right? We know the front suspension geometry and the rear suspension geometry is fine. We know that the arms now are fine on the tops and the fronts, and the backs are fine as well. However, areas of, and I have just went and rewatched 86 videos, areas of concern. The rear suspension pickups have no point on the plans that say this is where you want to put them on the chassis. So what I did was go, that seems right.
It was not right.
It was not right. I've now measured the drop on the rear where the roll bar goes down, and they are different heights. So that's what's going on with the back. So I'm going to have to cut them off.
So we should just fix that first.
We should fix that.
Because that then just gets out of the way.
It's also an easy win, right? But before I do that, I need to decide on the right height. Now I've measured the front and I've measured the back as it sits right now. The car is raking forward quite a bit. So we're going to have to bring the back down a bit, which is fine, but I'm not going to bring it down too much, because it's also where my fat arse sits. So there's going to have to be a slight amount of static rake in that. Maybe 20 mil, but not...
How much is that just now?
60.
That's quite a lot.
Quite a lot of rake.
That's
so
a lot.
We'll take some of that out. The lower arms, I think what's going on is there's a very, very subtle misalignment between the two.
I'm not entirely convinced.
I think it's that. Well, what do you think it could be?
I don't know. I need to look at it.
Right. What we're going to do is let Daniel have a look at it, because what can often happen when you're building an entire project yourself is you fail to see the woods for the trees. Now, me and Craig get this on a near weekly basis where we'll just be completely confounded with something. The other person comes in and goes, do that. And I'm like, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've done it as well. Like I've yet to do it to him. But one day...
It happens.
Yeah.
These things happen. There has to, for it to be that far off, there has to be something obvious. Because it's a mile off. It's not like a wee bit off.
Be my guest. What I'll do is I'll put it back and tripod the back end, so that it's purely the fronts in isolation.
Okay.
And you can see what you think. So remember what I said like 2 minutes ago, that sometimes you need somebody to just be able to see the woods for the trees? The reason, which has been expertly pointed out, that I have ride height issues is because my bump stops are different heights. Now, why would that make a difference? Because we're riding on the bump stops.
Yeah, so the shock's too long. So this is the height you want the car to run at, whereas the arms are basically level, or
that.
slightly above level.
They're actually sat on the bump stops.
Yeah, so being able to, like, at that point, if it's sitting on the rubber, you've got no way of accurately, you know, what we're saying, the car's tilted over to the side, you're going, yeah, but one side could just be...
Yeah, one's more bump stop than the other side, which, I mean, isn't normally something you need to consider, because you shouldn't be with nothing else going on, sat in the bump stop.
So because this is ideally for like double A arm suspension, you want the arms level at running height.
Yeah, look at that. I
It's
don't even
fully
think
compressed.
to check that they are fully compressed, but it's just sat there now. I've got far too much shock.
Until you've got a shock that's not on a bump stop, there could be nothing wrong with the car as such. All the arms could be perfect, but these shocks are quite a bit too long, because when this is fully jacked up,
We start adding or removing weight from the car. Look how much travel these shocks have got.
yeah, the amount of like
and they're
droop
still
in
going.
the suspension is...
And they're still going, and they're still going.
Yeah,
and
so-
that's us now off.
Yeah, so the thing is, at this point here, that's really what you want when the car's at ride height.
Yeah.
You need that sort of travel.
Yeah.
So these are really short travel shock. That amount of angle means you get quite a lot of travel for, you know, not a lot of shock compression.
Now, just to be fair, we did look at you checking the angle. So these are meant to be under 45 degrees of angle, and they're sitting at 40.
Yeah.
So that is exactly where the pickup should be. So that has been done correct.
Yeah.
But there's just not enough shock for it.
Yeah, so the problem is the only way that you'd make a shock this length work is you'd have to, if you moved this out a lot more so that the shock had to be longer, you know, to reach that point, that would pull the arms up.
The problem we have with that is that then changes the angle and makes the shock more ineffective, because it's not getting enough up and down the movement. It's more like this.
Yeah, so you need like exponentially stiffer springs to make it work.
New shocks.
Yeah, but what we could do, for the sake of checking that the car's okay, is we could take the bump stops out and just let it sit at ride height, so you've still got shock. You never run a car like that, because...
But what that will do is make sure the rest of the geometry is right, because whilst it will be beyond where a bump stop would safely be, it should, if my measurements are correct, sit level. Well, this has been a voyage of discovery today, because we decided, following the bump stop saga, rather than take the shocks off and go to the drama of working things out, let's just wind up the coilovers so that when it sits static, it's off the bump stops, and we'll just see and do the measurements in there. However,
the springs are so soft that you can't even get that.
I have added this much, and it's actually getting hard to compress the spring any further. They're almost, Christ.
Yeah, they're almost like bound.
Yeah, and we are still on the bump stop.
Yeah.
So I don't know what these are meant to be for, but they ain't working here.
Way too soft. These must be for something with a way steeper shock angle.
Yeah. Or else they're just a pair of rears. Because the thing you need to remember is, see on the back, they are near enough vertical, right? So that changes things dramatically, because, cameraman,
yeah, it's fine.
I've got spring, I can add damper, but there's loads of travel and things are okay. So these will work in this application, but when you add 45 degrees on it, it's a very different story, because it just works differently. You don't have that direct motion. You're almost amplifying the amount of load that these things become, because you've half the amount of you've half the amount of support they've got. So a spring will work to like £100 there. You need I would like to say £200. There's a ratio,
a lot less,
there's an equation for it. So the problem we've got here is these are working in the same way as the rear ones do, but because they're sitting at near 45 degrees angle, they're just not working. So these are used, right? They came off of a Locost, but I've got no way of verifying that. I don't know what the poundage is, I don't know what the measurements are. So
they look like they need to be like nearly twice as thick.
Yeah.
And like 2 to 3 inches shorter.
Yes.
When you jack it up, there's loads of down travel.
Yeah.
Insane amounts of down travel.
Check out how much spring comes off this.
There's like, this is like 4x4 levels of down travel, which on a race car you do not need that much. That's,
Yeah, so there we go, we're about to come off, and I'm still under spring compression at this point.
So what we want to do is we want to sacrifice down travel for more up travel.
Yeah, in essence. So what we're going to do next is we're going to have to take these off because there's no point leaving them on. It's not going to work. But once they're off, we're now also going to have a look at how much travel these have got as well. Because whilst that's a smoking gun, it's not clear evidence. We may still have issues with the amount of travel and the geometry of this that could also be adding up to why it's at squint. So that's next. We have measured things.
Yeah.
Measurements. Right, so starting with the back to use a measuring tape to work out what I've done wrong at some point. That's my unladen sizes, so understandably we're 260 and 245 at each side, which is why we're sitting with a squint. When I unladen it, obviously those measurements will be irrelevant because we've balanced it, but I've also took the degrees, so 9 degrees in this one, 3 degrees in that one, makes sense. But when I put it in the air, 14 and 18 degrees, so we're still sitting too far down in that.
Yeah, the shocks are a different place.
Yeah, so that would explain why when we get 165 and 155, that error happens on here. So the back is squint, that mount will need repositioned. So fear not, mounts, brackets, things. We've ordered these before obviously, but I've just ordered like another 4 because
just in case.
It's me. So that can go there and get rebuilt because I think the old one's going to die. I'm obviously going to have to cut it off and destroy the absolute shit out of it. But everything else kind of correlates okay in the back, so that should resolve that issue. That's what we're going to do next, because the fronts, we didn't really need to do much measurement because we tried to take the shocks out, and as usual, they are under tension. Like I physically would have
They're too long. They won't come out.
They're clearly too long. So we had to compress them to get them out of their slots once we unbolted them. At present, the shocks, which are all the same front and back, by the way.
That's an interesting one.
Very interesting, which makes me think I've bought 4 rear shocks because the front gap.
Well, you have.
It's 15 inch, so I've got a maximum of 15 inch unladen before, that's when it's like hitting against ball joints. It cannot go any more apart than 15 inches. So 13 inch, when we put it to the target height, rear and front leveled out, that's where I want the ride height to be. 13 inch is what that would need to be sat at. So
we need some droop.
We need some droop, so that would need to be 13 inch ideally. I have done, apologies for going from metric to imperial, but it also, this has a bearing because the shocks seem to be measured in inches, the ones I've been looking at. So, what size are the shocks that were on it or to begin with? 15.5 inch.
So this is way too long.
I've been jamming in completely the wrong
you need
shock.
like a 14.
14 inch I reckon is going to be the target. Because
or
then
13
that gives, well, a 14 or 13.5. I'm going to speak to somebody because clearly I'm way out of my depth at this point. But they're going to get ordered and we're going to finish up by sorting the rear out.
And then it'll be perfect.
And then it'll be perfect. And then it's just time to
drive.
Well, before we drive.
Dashboard.
Well, that can wait.
Paint.
I'm more thinking why I didn't have any power.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You fix that. We'll fix that.
Jesus. Right, I don't know what's went wrong here. In fact, I've got a rough idea. So I've set the ride height to where we were wanting the ride height to be to match the ride height there. And now that I have no spring in to do so, to make sure that my gap is as per what that one would be, it's on the bump stops. It's on the bump stops. Remember that chart from the front? Which brings me to an interesting conclusion. The springing could be because there's so little weight in the back that the arms have bound up in the bushes, possibly, and that's what the spring's been. And in actual fact, these have been on the bump stops the whole bloody time. Which means the fronts and the rears are on the bump stops, which would make sense because the springs are so ineffective in the front, the exact same springs in the back are probably going to be equally as ineffective. So, add to shopping basket 4 shock absorbers and the respective springs, because these springs are absolutely garbage. Right, now, what this does mean though is I'm going to have to now reset the whole car and work out what those gaps will need in the way of shock absorbers, because having done this, the interesting point I've noted, the fronts and the backs are the same gaps. So I have measured it to something, and I have got it right to something. I just can't remember what it was. But the fact that having sorted the 10mm offset difference that this one needed, the hole-to-holes from the lower arms to the pickup points in the chassis are as neat as damn it the same as what they are in the front when I'm sat at that static ride height I'm looking for. Interesting. Having achieved nothing by reattaching this other than making sure it's symmetrical, I'm going to just weld it back up because there's no point in it not being welded. It's going to be where it needs to be. However, we are going to have to go and buy things. So that is pretty much as far as I can go at this stage. So like, bell, subscribe if you're into this level of complete and utter idiocy when it comes to suspension. If you feel like buying me a coffee to say, Christ mate, cheer up, it can't all be that bad, patreon.com/toolsandtrack. And until next weekend, and it will be low cost next weekend, drive safe.